There are so many compelling stories of heroic ships during the Second World War, a war that was fought across the world's oceans, sometimes in great fleets of some of the largest warships that were ever built. But few single warships of that war had as much impact on the outcome of the war than the SS Ohio. It wasn't a great battleship, it was a merchant tanker. It was only armed with a small naval gun and some anti-aircraft guns, and yet it carried a cargo that was vital to preserving a strategically important island that changed the course of the war. The story of the SS Ohio, savior of Malta, is history that deserves to be remembered. In August of 1942, there was not a more strategically important bit of real estate than the 316 square kilometer archipelago of Malta. Malta's location in the Mediterranean between Italy and Africa had made it an important center for trade and a military target since antiquity. The island had been colonized by the Phoenicians in the 8th century BC, fallen under the hegemony of Carthage in the 6th century, been raided by Rome during the First Punic War in 255 BC, and ceded to Rome at the outset of the Second Punic War 37 years later. The islands were conquered by the Aghlabids, Muslims from Tunisia in the 9th century, and then by Normans from Sicily 2 centuries later. In 1530, Charles V, King of Sicily, granted the islands to the Order of St. John as a vassal state. The order had withstood a massive siege by the Ottoman Empire in 1565. In 1798, the island was taken from the order by Napoleon on his way to invade Egypt, the subject of another episode of the History Guy, and then conquered by the British after a lengthy siege in 1800. During the First World War, Malta was the headquarters of the British Mediterranean Fleet, served as an important naval base, and its hospitals were used to treat the wounded coming from Africa and the Balkans. So many wounded were treated there that Malta was called the nurse of the Mediterranean. But the island, the scene of so much conflict over the centuries, would face extreme hardships in the Second World War, where the tiny British protectorate astride the Axis supply lines to Africa was one of the most strategically important locations of the war. Modern mechanized armies require fuel, and North Africa, especially control of the Suez Canal, was both a critical supply route to connect Britain with its empire and the key to controlling oil from the Middle East. Thus, control over North Africa and the Mediterranean was a key both to keeping the United Kingdom in the war and to supplying Hitler's armies with fuel. The war in North Africa began June 10, 1940. Italy had remained neutral through Hitler's invasion of Poland and the Low Countries, but Mussolini decided to join the fight when Germany invaded France. He declared war 6 days after the British evacuation at Dunkirk. Italy's entry into the war represented a huge threat to the British supply lines through the Suez and Mediterranean. The Italian Navy had 183 combat ships in the Mediterranean, while the British Mediterranean Fleet, based in Egypt, only had 45. Italy had more than 250,000 troops in Libya, ready to attack the 100,000 troops defending British Egypt. Now Britain, already facing the threat of invasion across the Channel and the loss of its ally France, was facing both a land war in North Africa and a sea war in the Mediterranean that threatened its vital lines of supply. As the war in North Africa swung back and forth, the tiny archipelago of Malta, the only British base between Gibraltar and Alexandria, was a critical point both to supply British forces, but also to interdict Axis supply lines to their forces in Africa. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called Malta the windlass to the tourniquet on Axis supply lines for the Africa campaign. First Italian and later German plans to invade Malta never materialized, but Malta became the center of a 2-year, significant and shifting air battle. At times, the forces on Malta, planes and submarines, were able to carry out offensive operations against the Italian Navy and Axis shipping, but the island was under almost constant attack. Attrition of air units on the island was large, and there were always shortages of fuel and spare parts. Multiple operations were undertaken to ferry more planes to defend Malta, but such operations were costly. Malta became one of the most intensely bombed places of the war, and the population largely moved out of the cities. The Italians made significant efforts to isolate Malta, including laying tens of thousands of sea mines around the islands. The defenders of Malta were often reduced to the point where they could only put up a token few planes to defend the island. In 1941, Italian defeats in Africa compelled Germany to reinforce the Italians with the Deutsche Afrika Korps. This brought in the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, which was able to maintain periods of air superiority over the islands and drove back the Royal Navy. By June of 1942, no convoy had managed to reach Malta in 9 months. Supplies were brought in by submarines and fast minesweepers, a service called the Magic Carpet, but these methods could only carry a small amount of supply, and losses due to mines and planes were common. The British were able to keep the island supplied enough to hold, but only just. And that was requiring more and more shifting of resources and mounting losses among the merchant vessels supplying the islands and the naval vessels supporting them. Malta was short of food, of ammunition for its anti-aircraft guns, and most especially, of fuel oil. Churchill warned the House of Commons that Malta was essential to the whole strategic position in the Middle East. In June, a significant effort was made to supply the islands, sending 2 convoys simultaneously, one from Gibraltar and one from Alexandria. The results were disastrous. The Italians had broken a U.S. military code, and the Axis had forewarning of the plans. Included in the convoy from Gibraltar was the 9,300 long-ton tanker SS Kentucky. Built for the Texas Oil Company, Kentucky had made its maiden voyage across the Atlantic to take aviation fuel to Gibraltar, where it had been given over to the British Ministry of War Transport and given a British crew. SS Kentucky, carrying 13,000 tons of oil, was the only tanker in the convoy coming from Gibraltar and Malta's best hope. The convoy had a significant escort of 1 battleship, 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, 17 destroyers, 4 minesweepers, an oiler, a mine layer, 2 corvettes, and 6 motor patrol boats. Kentucky survived an air attack that sunk a Dutch vessel in the convoy and severely damaged a British cruiser, but was not able to survive the next day, when persistent air attacks by Italian naval vessels and aircraft finally disabled her engines. She was abandoned and sunk by the Italians. Of the June convoys, only 2 merchant vessels made it to Malta. The situation was dire. Malta was on the verge of collapse. There would be a moonless period in the Mediterranean between August 10th and 16th, and Churchill realized that window was the last chance to prevent Malta's surrender, something which he told the House of Commons would be a disaster of the first magnitude for the Empire. He was determined to create a convoy of fast merchant vessels with significant naval protection. But there was a problem. The British had no large oil tanker fast enough for the convoy. In fact, only 1 such vessel was available anywhere in the world at the time. The Kentucky's sister ship, SS Ohio. Laid down in September 1939 at the Sun Shipbuilding Yard in Chester, Pennsylvania, the Ohio had been a design influenced by the war, which planners knew would eventually involve the United States. Combining cargo capacity and speed necessary for merchant ships to survive in time of war, the 515-foot, 9,264 gross registered tonnage vessel could make 16 knots on her Westinghouse turbine engines. Capable of carrying 170,000 barrels of fuel oil, Ohio was the largest tanker ever built to that time. When she was launched in April 1940, Florence Rogers, the mother of the president of the Texas Oil Company, christened the ship with a bottle of champagne and said, "May God go with her, and all who sail in her." In May 1942, SS Ohio picked up a load of fuel oil in Galveston, Texas, had a 5-inch naval gun mounted on her stern and a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun mounted on her bow for protection from planes and submarines, and on May 25th set sail for Great Britain. Ohio arrived in the Thames Tideway on June 18th, 3 days after SS Kentucky was lost. It was the first load of fuel oil delivered to Great Britain in an American tanker during the war. Ohio was requisitioned by the British Ministry of War Transport, transferred to the British Eagle Oil and Transport Company, and given a British crew. Her engines were mounted on rubber bearings and steam pipes fitted with steel springs, hoping to prevent the damage that had disabled the Kentucky. On August 3rd, Ohio sailed for Gibraltar, one of 14 merchant ships in the convoy, given the code name Operation Pedestal. The convoy would be protected by a fleet of 2 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers, 32 destroyers, and 7 submarines. They left Gibraltar for Malta the morning of August 9th, in heavy fog. The convoy faced constant attack. Torpedoes from a German submarine sank the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle on the 10th. 260 men died. On the 12th, the convoy came under attack from the air by a combined German and Italian force. During the confusion of the attack, Ohio was struck amidship by a torpedo from the Italian submarine Axum. The torpedo tore a 24-foot by 27-foot hole in the port side of the midship pump room and tore all the way through to the starboard side. The deck collapsed. Kerosene from a fractured tank caught fire, forcing the captain to shut down the engine to fight the fires. After the fires were extinguished, the ship was still able to make 13 knots. But the steering gear had been blown away, and they were using emergency gear in the aft of the ship. But Ohio was not out of danger, as the attacking planes now focused on the tanker. A Ju-87 dive bomber was shot by anti-aircraft fire, but crashed into Ohio's starboard side, spraying the deck with debris. Luckily, the plane's bomb did not explode. Near misses by 2 planes lifted Ohio out of the water, Only the new rubber engine mounts and the ship's differential gearing kept the engine from being torn off its mounts. Another bomb blew out the boiler fires, and the ship had to relight the boilers before they lost power to the pumps. They restarted the boilers only to be struck by another bomb, which disabled the electric fuel pumps. A destroyer, HMS Penn, came to Ohio's rescue, attaching a tow line, but the two ships were having trouble making headway. As dusk was approaching, Ohio was struck again. This time the bomb hit in the same location where she'd been struck by the torpedo. The ship's back was broken. The following morning, HMS Penn was joined by a minesweeper, HMS Rye. The two ships were able to tow the crippled tanker at 5 knots, but the air attacks continued. More hits forced Ohio's crew to abandon ship, but two more destroyers, HMS Branham and HMS Ledbury, came to Ohio's aid. HMS Rye attached a tow line, while HMS Ledbury acted as a stern tug. HMS Penn had to come along the starboard side to steer. The group, making some 6 knots, came under air attack again. The first wave of dive bombers missed, but 3 more waves were coming, and the group of ships, unable to maneuver, were sitting ducks. But as the dive bombers moved in for what seemed to be an easy target, they suddenly came under attack by British Spitfires. The planes came from Malta, as the group had moved close enough to come under the island's air cover. But one bomber managed to break free, just missing with its 1,000-pound bomb, which struck in Ohio's wake. The shock threw Ohio forward, severing its tow line and buckling hull plates. Ohio, still 45 miles from Malta, was sinking. Under the cover of the Spitfires, HMS Penn kept its position starboard, and HMS Ledbury moved to Ohio's port. It was now a race to get Ohio to Malta before she sank. As they moved towards the Grand Harbor, a German submarine and a group of torpedo boats moved in, but they were driven off by Malta's shore batteries. Outside the harbor, tugs from Malta moved in and took Ohio, still lashed to Penn and Ledbury, into the harbor. Ohio's midship was already awash as they rolled into the harbor, which was strewn with wrecks from the long siege. People lined the harbor, cheering. A band played Rule Britannia. Salvage pumps were used to remove Ohio's precious cargo as the tanker slowly settled to the bottom of the harbor. Even as the brave vessel sank, SS Ohio had saved Malta. The British took terrible losses in Operation Pedestal. 9 of the 14 merchant vessels that had been assigned to the convoy were sunk, and in addition the British lost the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle, 2 cruisers, HMS Manchester and HMS Cairo, and a destroyer, HMS Foresight. In the end, more than 400 sailors that had been assigned to the convoy lost their lives. There's still an argument over whether Operation Pedestal was a victory or a loss for the Allies, but in the end, Malta was saved. The supplies and fuel oil that arrived were enough to support Maltese offensive operations for another 10 weeks during some of the most critical points in the North Africa campaign. Because Malta held, Axis supply ships had to go a greater distance to reach Africa, giving a greater chance that they could be intercepted by the Allies. In 1942, the Allies sank 2/3 of the Italian merchant fleet and interdicted 2/3 of the fuel oil and nearly half of the total supply that was headed for Rommel's Africa Corps. Those supply shortages played a critical role in the British victory at the Second Battle of El Alamein the following October. German Rear Admiral Erhard Weinkold said of the failure to stop Ohio from reaching Malta, it was a strategic failure of the First Order by the Axis. The Axis kept up their air attacks on Malta, but newly resupplied with fighters, Malta was able to defend itself. The losses to Axis aircraft in the attacks further weakened their forces in Africa. By November, convoys were again able to reach Malta, lifting the siege. SS Ohio broke into 2 parts as she sunk. She was simply too damaged to repair. In 1946, the 2 halves were towed out to sea and sunk by naval gunfire to prevent navigational hazard. Parts of SS Ohio, her steering wheel, her nameplate, are on display in the Malta War Museum. Trying to understand the impact of Operation Pedestal and SS Ohio, you really have to understand what would have happened had the operation failed. If Malta had fallen, Rommel would have had unfettered access to supply, which means that he quite possibly could have taken the Suez Canal, cut off Britain from Australia and India, forced Britain out of the war, provided unlimited fuel oil supplies to Hitler's armies fighting the Russians. The war could have been lost before the United States could enter and make a difference. Rarely has a single ship made such an important impact on the outcome of a war. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.